Now, we're going to get a perspective from the US. And I'm delighted to introduce you to Jim McFarland, senior economist from the US's Environment Policy Agency's Climate Change Division. He can tell us all about the IRA from the front row. Jim, great to have you with us. Take it away.
Nisha, I really appreciate it. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this conference for a long time now. Looks like I hit next too far. Okay, here we go. So I want to talk to you about the U.S. landscape. And the energy landscape in the U.S. has changed dramatically just within the last couple of years. Just to give you a sense for where I'm going to be talking about this from, my perspective, I'm with the U.S. EPA. In the Climate Change Division, we produce the greenhouse gas inventory for the United States, and we also do a lot of analytical support to support decision-making and policymakers, and we work with a lot of the folks that also support this conference and our partners here, JICRI, NREL, and also MIT. I'm going to bookend my remarks talking about sort of two different reports. The first one came out in 2021, and it's the long-term strategy of the United States. That's how the U.S. can get to net zero by 2050, different energy and emissions pathways. And then the second report I'm going to talk about just came out in last year, 2023, talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. And it used 10 different models to evaluate the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on U.S. emissions. And we're going to contrast and compare those two. So this is a historic period for U.S. policy and climate change. We had the Biden administration came in, they had a refocus on climate change, made that a much higher priority, and there were three acts of Congress from 2021 to 2022, the Infrastructure Investment Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and then finally the largest of the three, the Inflation Reduction Act. Combined with, in 2023, we also had proposed regulations by EPA and DOE to regulate power plants and also vehicles. And then finally, on the appliances, that DOE handles the appliance side, EPA handles vehicles and the fossil fuel-fired power plants. So the aims of the Inflation Reduction Act, there's really three areas that the Act aims to benefit Americans. One is consumer savings, cheaper electricity through renewables and energy efficiency. You also have incentives for American manufacturing, so jobs, promoting clean energy and manufacturing in the US. And then finally, also protecting vulnerable communities, so people that are disadvantaged, low income, but then also areas that may be transitioning away from fossil fuels. So how to keep those people, improve their well-being, make sure they have good livelihoods and strong incomes. But the entire act is really about building momentum, which is the theme of this conference. This is really building momentum for policies in the US. To give you a sense of the scope of the Inflation Reduction Act, it is up to $1.4 trillion, I think, of some of the estimates that have been talked about in the press. The reasons why that becomes so high, there's very different estimates as to how much clean energy you might have adopted by this act. The act spans a 10-year period. That's sort of the budget window for the United States. So after 2022 or 2032, a lot of those policies will sort of expire. But it really provides a substantial amount of support for the electric power sector, for electric vehicles, clean manufacturing, but then also residential and homes to promote the option of energy efficiency and heat pumps. So that helps them lower their bills, but still meet all of the energy demands and services demands that they have. There's also a lot of cross-cutting aspects of the legislation that promotes hydrogen, direct air capture, and also carbon sequestration. And there's also a lot of cross-cutting provisions that, again, try to protect these vulnerable and at-risk communities. The Investment Act and also the CHIPS and Science Act, those also promote enabling infrastructure to build out the power grid, to enable hydrogen pipelines, and then also to have grid improvement and also EV charging stations. Those become really important, but the absolute dollar terms are not as great. So to talk through what the impacts of this are going to be, the chart I'm showing you is from the US Biennial Report from 2023. And so the top red line is basically showing emissions over time through 2005 to 2035. We have historic emissions in black. The red line is showing what the emissions would be as the 2021 baseline. So this was the projected emissions from 2021 for the US. It's falling, but very, very low. Inflation Reduction Act and the other two acts were passed, and when we analyze that using 10 different models, we show a dramatic decrease in emissions from what the 2021 baseline was. We're seeing now in 2030 of emission reductions between 33 and 41%. Now that doesn't meet the stated objectives of the administration of around 50% by 2030, but it brings us a lot closer than where we were before, which is incredibly important. The green line, that represents the long-term strategy of the US. So that gets us on a net zero pathway. So again, we're not there in the blue lines where the Inflation Reduction Act is taking us. We're not there yet. And so the question is how can the Inflation Reduction Act, how can we leverage that to build momentum and achieve that, the green line, more of the long-term strategy to reach net zero? So a few things are going to be required. One, first of all, we need to assess the benefits and how far the vehicle rules and the EPA power plant rules will get us to that lower target. Those haven't been analyzed yet. They'll be finalized hopefully this year, and then we can kind of go rerun our models and take stock of how far those new regulations will get us. The other part that we want to do is accelerate and really meet the needs of the Inflation Reduction Act and really accelerate investment in the clean energy space, in manufacturing, also in buildings and transportation. The figure at the right, essentially that's showing historic builds plus the expected new builds required under the Inflation Reduction Act. So historic capacity additions in the US are really much lower than what we might expect to see under the Inflation Reduction Act, what would be economically viable. And a lot of the modeling that we've done would suggest that you need to increase the rate of expansion of wind and solar, what's economically viable, by 50% up to 200% in some of the models. To do that, it really requires to break some bottlenecks on building out transmission capacity. It also requires people to project developers to be more active, and we're also seeing some early evidence that there is a bit of resistance to, at the community level, to certain adopting solar and wind in certain areas. That can create increased time for developers to actually implement this. So dealing with those challenges are some near-term things. Looking more at the long term, the figure at the right shows essentially a lot of the different pathways and the steps that need to happen to get to net zero by 2050 in the US. All of those different areas and pathways have been incentivized by the IRA, but again, the IRA only lasts for 10 years. So you need to figure out what's going to happen after that, and you're probably not going to get there through subsidies alone. So what we need, and there's a lot of these points are being made by a National Academy of Science and Medicine report on accelerating decarbonization in the United States. They recommend going with greenhouse gas taxes, which obviously makes sense. You want to disincentivize carbon pollution. You also want to do a better job of decarbonizing the power grid and promoting the electrification of end use. So more regulatory actions to promote clean energy and getting fossil fuel-fired power plants off the grid is sort of their recommendations. There's also a lot of utility planning. Utilities don't really plan for a net zero future, so improving the way and how they value the transition and the technologies to get to a net zero world will be really, really important. And then finally, a lot of increased aid for state and local support, because if you can't really maintain the momentum without providing and engaging the states and localities in this transition. But I think the key message here is really quite a positive one. The Inflation Reduction Act really does transform the US clean energy landscape. There's more to be done to get to net zero, but this is an important and necessary, essential first step. So thank you very much.